People have the imagination that it has existed since 70s, maybe. So it's very interesting to listen to people who are working today within social work activities and different parts of social work. In this session, I will welcome Marcus and the Linda and Kristin and just stay still, and Camilla from Finland to this session. What I am going to do is, everybody welcome. What I'm going to do is to just present a very short 10 minutes, the book that you have been part of that and contributed to it. And then we are going to have a discussion around some questions to know what we are and what the Nordic welfare state today is composed of and how it works in relation to social work. I try to share the screen about the book. I know how it works now. Yeah. The book was a project in cooperation between different countries, and then we asked other people to participate in this project about the changing condition of Swedish welfare states and the Nordic welfare states, and then we get together. And we got together and wrote this book, for which myself and Jessica Johnson have been editor for, and you people have been contributors, and other people also too. So the whole discussion was, what happens to the Nordic and to the Swedish welfare state? What's going on? When we have been in different conferences internationally in contact with our colleagues, people talked about Sweden and the Nordic countries, as I said, like the model for welfare states and social work and a well-functioning societies in which socioeconomic gaps and social problems are less frequent in comparison to other countries, before all, liberal countries like UK and US. I have to use this one. First of all, after our discussion, it was clear that something is changing, something is happening, not only in other parts of the world, but also in Sweden and in other Nordic countries, which is called the neoliberal turn. Something have changed since 80s and in many countries, but since 90s in Nordic countries, different times. At the early 90s in Sweden, for instance, at later in Denmark or in Norway and Finland. So the neoliberal turn was about, we know that the discussion was that this Nordic system of welfare state created what Margaret Thatcher said, a nanny state. The state that just takes care of people who do not want to work, people who don't want to contribute to the good of society, and so on. So social expenditure was the center of the welfare state in Nordic countries, for instance, and in many other countries too. But the neoliberal turn, the critique of the Keynesian society, the Keynesian model, economic model, and the social welfare system was that the social expenditure is the problem, is not the answer, that you use social resources, socioeconomic resources in a society and distribute them to reduce conflicts and to work against social problems. So the social expenditure was considered from 70s and early 80s in Sweden and in other Nordic countries as cost for the state and society, which counteracts economic growth. It means that economic growth is based on less social expenditure. When people need to work, when people need to act on their own for their individual interest, it's the motor of economy. And they said that unemployment, low growth, of those are consequences of this socioeconomic system, or what called Nordic welfare state or welfare state. The answer was to eliminate the intervention of state. As Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, as some remember, said in early 80s, that the state is not the solution, it's the problem. It's the problem for the economy if the state intervene in society, in economy and in the market. So neoliberal policies and the market without intervention of the state is the only answer, is the only way forward. And we know what happened even in England, in UK, and in other countries by these policies, which gradually came to Sweden and other Nordic welfare states and countries. Today, we know that neoliberal policies influence every human domain, along with human subjectivity, which means how we consider ourselves, how we consider other citizens, other people, their problems, our problems. Everything is measured by economic and the economic results, efficiency, and in all which has to do with market and market rules. What happened is that the state, the welfare state of the Nordic countries, for instance, they changed, not only of Nordic countries, but in these discussions that we are going to have, I'm just concentrating on Nordic countries. The neoliberal state, they said, is going to be a very little. It's not going to intervene in market. It's a weak, but it's this assumption we wrote in that book that it's not correct, because the state is both weak and strong at the same time. How it's possible? The state is very marginal when it's about the welfare states. The welfare state is retreating. The state is weakening in its traditional role to intervene in the market, to redistribute the resources, and to create a less conflictual society with less class differences and so on. This state is very weak today. The policies changed. At the same time, the state is becoming more stronger. The strong oppressive state is important to securitize and serve the market, because when you have the market and reducing welfare states and the intervention of state, so the social conflicts, socioeconomic conflicts, ethnic conflicts, whatever you call it, increase. The history of modern nation states learned us. So to counteract that, it's not going to be to go back to welfare system, to redistribution of resources, but of exercising physical and symbolic violence. The symbolic violence means that you'd say that the only way it's neoliberalism. All protest and resistance to that can be categorized as anti-social, anti-political system or enmity to the existing system. But as Michel Foucault says, the neoliberal state is not just based on physical and symbolic violence, but also it, in a way, through governmentalization, controlling our educational system, our media, the way that we are raising our children, and so on and so on. They are learning us that it's the only way. And it creates interpersonal relations funded of market individualism. You have to save yourself. You are responsible for your future. You are responsible for your problems. You are responsible for your life. And what happened in the Nordic welfare states, the whole concept of Nordic welfare states was based on, you can say, three pillars. One was that the industrial society, the assumption was in Nordic countries that creates a surplus, sufficient surplus, which we can use to guarantee all citizens fundamental rights, fundamental goods such as disposable income, housing, clothing, and food. It was the assumption that we have resources. The economy allows us to create much surplus that we can use and redistribute to people, to those who need it. And of course, the concept of justice, fairness in redistribution of resources are part of the social democratic ideology and the ideology of the welfare state. And of course, the assumption was also that redistribution of resources creates opportunity. It's not against what neoliberals said, that the welfare states in contract development and so on. We know that from the history that it was not correct. And also it makes possible that many people that otherwise could not have resources, could not have the same chances to come to the market, to educate themselves, to take place in society, they have a voice, could do that. It was the assumptions of the Nordic welfare states. But of course, it changed. Today, after changing the Nordic welfare states and of course, neoliberalization of the Nordic countries, you see that the state is not seeing itself anymore as the agent of welfare for people or responsible for preventing social problems. Social problems are not individualized. It's the responsible of individual to make their own lives. And of course, when we are talking about social work, the governmental and municipal social work, which is still more than 90% of social work in at least Sweden and many Nordic countries, it's increasingly restructuring in accordance with the neoliberal ideology, who again considers people with social problems as deviants, which was a discussion in liberal countries for several decades, even before Second World War. But now again, we see that social problems makes the individual problems, the problems of individuals, and individuals are given an agency in creating social problems for themselves. So, and it is, and they are doing that by exercising administrative power. Or Marcus Herz wrote about in an article, I think, about administrative operation, if I'm right. So I just finished the stop sharing. Well, it was just a short presentation of what we discuss in this book, and everybody who participated as authors in different parts of the book had their examples of neoliberalization of the Nordic welfare states. Fortunately, we have some of them here, and we are going to have a discussion on really what happened with the Nordic welfare state and what are we on our way and what are we going from here. So I like to start by asking all of you to give us examples or a description of what is happening in your country, what's happening based off this neoliberalization of society and neoliberal changes. Want to start maybe by Linda from Denmark. Please, Linda. Very welcome.
There it was. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the very interesting social work narratives, which I also found very, very, very interesting. I would say that they really remarkable, actually touch upon all the themes that I think is of importance in my research. So we might address that. I would just want to sketch out a little bit how I have worked with neoliberal practices in Denmark as part of my research. I'm a professor at Roskilde University in learning, evaluation, and social innovation. I am actually a social worker previously. I have a social work degree, and I worked very shortly as a social worker, and then I went back to academia. But I have since actually done research on themes that are very, very much situated and central for social work. I work with welfare services, democracy, collaboration with service users, citizens, carers, professionals, bureaucrats, municipalities. I work with social entrepreneurship and the civic society. So that's my actually entrance into this topic of neoliberal and how that has influenced Denmark. And I'm also, working with the Nordic countries. So some of the themes that I would want to point to, which I think is quite interesting, is actually that what I think is interesting for us is, of course, both to focus on policy and policies, as is clear in this book Masoud and Jessica has edited, but also on neoliberal practices. Because from my point of view, it's extremely important that we actually have this kind of a double perspective, because we need to understand the practices. We also need to understand the policies. And the narratives we have just heard were very beautifully intertwining that. They talked about both policies, politics, and they talked about practices. So from my point of view, I have been working quite a bit on understanding, analyzing, gathering data, in the field of civic society organizations that work, as is very much known in the Nordic countries, and of course other European countries as well. And the civic society organizations are actually a new unit. It's a new unit in the neoliberal politics and in the practices, because as part of the neoliberal development and the neoliberal social welfare state, the civic society organizations are going to be partners, and they're going to engage in private-public collaborations, and they're going to bring forward, the new regime that characterizes the neoliberal policies and politics. So some of the highlights, because when preparing for this, I thought, okay, so what is important? What would I want to bring forward? So 3 themes, I think, which I found was really significant, and I want to present those. The first one is that not just in my research, but also in my research, this has been, of course, validated or confirmed by international scholars and practices. What we see is that the human rights position is losing ground in favor of the entrepreneurial labor market subject. That is that previously, and Masoud also talked about that, previously the welfare state guarded the kind of the notion of the welfare state recipient or the citizens as a human rights subject, that we have rights, that we should be treated, fair and equal, and that we should expect that the welfare state and the better off are taking care of those. What we see today is that, and that's part of the neoliberal practices and policy, is that now it's much more entrepreneurial. The entrepreneurial subject, as you said, is the ones that takes care of herself and himself. And that has deepened, it has deep roots in social policy, labor market policy, educational policy, housing. It's permeating everything, which is really, really troublesome, and is actually something that social workers have to deal with, but that we as scholars and researchers should have to look into. So this is a huge trend, and many would see it as a progress. I mean, that's the really kind of worrisome part of it. They would see it also as a progress. They would see it as individualizing, but in a good way, that you can be brought forward as somebody that can contribute value. So they would say it's a value laden. So that's the first one. The second one is that that neoliberalism and that its practices provides and changes people to become commodified. You know, that we have a value and that we should produce value, and that human growth is a commodity, and it's also something that has to be dealt with by performativity. And the social worker narratives was all just about that, so that we would understand, you know, we would make numbers, we would do performance key indicators, that's the word for it, you know, one month, 2 months, 3 months, in order to bring, you know, young people on their feet again, or long-term unemployment on their feet again, which is efficiency has been rationalized, and we are bringing forward numbers. And it is widespread, as you know, not only in the civic society organizations, in social work, in educational educational organizations, in a lot of public bodies as well. So the third one is this tendency that neoliberal practices individualizes and thereby hampers the collectivization or the systemic understandings. That was said very beautiful as well. So that it's very, very difficult to, as part of this regime, as part of this discourse, to go beyond the individuals, the subject, the citizens, the service users, or the professional social worker. And thereby it is actually changing a very strong Nordic tradition for democracy, for collectivizing. You know, we have a grand history in the Nordic countries for, you know, cooperatives, andelsbevægelsen, which is a historic phenomenon. So that is changing radically. And of course, we need to take care of that, and we need to talk about how to change that. So these three themes, I think, very much intertwine changes, you know, the whole welfare state, the whole civic society in Denmark, and that has a lot of consequences.
Thank you very much, Linda, for your insights, and thank you for, I forgot to ask you to present yourself too. Thank you very much that you did it. So with the, so please, the next one, Camilla, would you please present yourself and give us some insights in Finland about the neoliberal changes in Finnish society? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Masoud, and thanks so much for being invited to this conference. It would have been so inspiring. I was listening to the very last bit of the practitioners' experiences as well, but unfortunately I had, due to some family obligations, I couldn't attend earlier today, which was really a pity. But I have, well, briefly, I really would like to follow up on what Linda said. I think much of what she said is very common to all of the Nordic countries, indeed. But I've also been thinking about and doing some research myself on the ways in which neoliberal policies have influenced practices. And I think when we talk about cost effectiveness and different kinds of austerity measures, also in the Finnish case, we can see quite a strong projectification of social work with an increasing role for NGOs. And I really find this intriguing. In a way, it's very paradoxical, because on the one hand you get, I mean, it really enables some kind of grassroots activism as well, and knowledge production that draws on service user experiences and the knowledge that is created within these NGOs that really work on the street level with disadvantaged service users, which is good in many ways. But I also think it's really what we've seen in Finland. It's quite problematic because there's also this, we also see a polarization in the professional field of social work. So you have, on the one hand, you have university-trained social workers that also have training in doing structural social work and critical analysis in different ways, but they are increasingly employed in tasks that require juridical knowledge, and they are also, a lot of their working time is also used to work with the middle classes and problems related to child custody disputes and things like this, while the most structurally disadvantaged service users, the poor, people with drug addiction problems, are more dependent on paraprofessionals and NGOs, and you see a gap between that the most disadvantaged service users might have less access to university-trained social work than they did before. So I think this is something that we need more research on, and that I think is really interesting in many ways. And we also have, I mean, the Finnish context is a bit different also from the other Nordic countries in the sense that we also have two routes to becoming a social worker. You have the university trained social workers that has a master degree and are quite academic in many ways, but then we also have the polytechnics where you receive a degree at the polytechnic level, and you can also see some differences in where these professionals are working and the service users that can access different kinds of social work. So I think this is, and it's very much related to the austerity policies and the neoliberal policies. And somehow, I think from the point of view of the state, in a way, I think it's a bit, I mean, on the one hand, it's, for example, in social work with migrant background people that I've done research on myself, ethnographic research where I've been observing encounters between social workers and the local welfare state and migrant service users. I think we can see that it's really problematic in the sense that you have there's a lot of goodwill here because we employ native speakers to assist these migrant background people to fill out forms and so forth in there, and they can use their own language. But then that also means that they don't access, they're not necessarily professional social workers, which is also due, of course, to the barriers in the path to social work education. But this is complex, but I think it's just some examples that relate to what Linda says. But I think I will finish. I could talk a lot more about this, but I will give the floor to someone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. Yeah, Ann-Kristin, hello, and please, the floor is yours. About telling us something about neoliberalism and neoliberal changes in Norway. It's muted. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for being invited to this important event. And it has been so many important things that's been said. I think that I would like to add that I would like to say that the rising inequality is a challenge also for social workers in Norway due to neoliberalism, because although Norway still is among the most generous welfare states in the world, inequality in earnings and wealth has steadily increased. And social workers are now facing a social policy that has become less capable, as Masoud said in the introduction, less capable of redistributing resources and providing directly to the needs of people. And especially social workers in Norway is meeting challenges when they are increasingly asked to enable individuals to manage risks. And this is especially a problem when social workers are working with the activation policies. Because in Norway, one of the strongest expressions of neoliberal policies is the activation programs. And because although the results of activation policy are hotly debated, both in research and literature and among social workers, today all vulnerable groups, adults, youth, migrants, and refugees are expected to compete in the labor market, although they are less likely to be employed and to participate on equal terms. And for social workers who are working within the activation programs, this is a dilemma. Also when the notion of empowerment is sort of inverted due to neoliberal politics, that it's about people being able to help themselves, and not sort of the strength perspective that social work usually have as a tradition. I think the activation policies is a great challenge for social work in Norway.
Well, thank you very much. And Marcus, please, Marcus Herz.
Yes, yes, I'm here, I'm awake. Thank you. My name is Marcus Herz, and I am a social worker as well, and associate professor at Malmö University on the Department of Social Work. I was thinking about what I could add to this, because I mean, activation and what Linda was talking about is also relevant from a Swedish perspective, of course, and also what Camilla said. But I was thinking about a couple of things that hasn't been mentioned really. For one thing, I think the individualization also tend to shift towards a biologization that we sometimes talk about in our chapter that we wrote for the book, for instance, which is interesting, that what seems to be perceived as more measurable and more valid in some way tend to be the way that you go in some parts of social work, for instance, when we're working with people using drugs or similar. And that the relationship-based social works tend to be left aside, really. The other thing I was thinking about is, I would argue that one huge neoliberal change to social work in Sweden and probably in all other countries as well is the depoliticization of social work, that social work is considered almost neutral in some way, and the political debate about social work is silent, I would argue, from a Swedish perspective. That's one thing I think is really important. And the third thing I would like to, that Masoud mentioned it in the beginning, and I mean, that's the thing for all Nordic welfare states, that's we have this idea that the Nordic welfare state system was generous, and people in general in Sweden, I think, still have a very, believe the authorities. I don't know how to say that in English actually, but and I think that's really complicates the issue. I think that's why it has been so easy to adapt to a neoliberal welfare state in the Nordic countries, because I would argue that that's a myth. We never had really a generous welfare state. Yeah, probably a couple of years, but all in all, no, we never had a generous welfare state. It's always been people, for instance, through institutional racism or other things that has been left aside from the general welfare state. And I think that's important to bring that into this discussion when we talk about how the neoliberal changes actually influence the social work today, because if we buy into the myth, I think it's hard to really see the changes taking place, actually. I don't know if that makes sense, but in my head it does. Anyway, that's a couple of things. And I would also like to mention, before I go back to Masoud, that I mean, there's parallel developments, especially in Sweden, when you talk about the school system, for instance. That's important to also discuss in relation to social work. We wouldn't have the situation we have in Sweden now with inequalities and segregation if it weren't for the changes in our school system a couple of years, which also, of course, put even more pressure on social workers to try and work against this segregation and inequalities that we see in Sweden. So, okay, I think I stopped there right for now.
Right, thank you very much. Of course, to just say that the recent statistic on death in COVID-19 is very interesting example, and the increasing marginalization in our major cities. So it's very interesting to also address, and we cannot do that now, but maybe in other sessions or other conferences. Anyway, so do you have any mobilization? I mean, both within academy, which all of us are from, or out of that, against these neoliberal changes? So please, Linda, if you can start.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have been thinking about this because that was one of your good but challenging questions. I think that we need to understand that if we agree upon that neoliberalism and the practices induces individualization and lesser collectivization, then if that's the case, then that influences hugely on the lack of collective resistance. As you know, it's not just a matter of our research and our data and the people we work with. It's also working in the organizations, in the institutions, educational institutions, that is the case. So I think, interestingly enough, it is like this, that the historic strong social movement in the Nordic countries has diminished. It's not totally gone. I won't say that, definitely, but it has changed a lot. So what we see, I think, I thought about it as part of the professions and the professionals. That's one group. Service users, citizens, their carers, their parents, their relatives, networks is a second one, and third one is the research, the universities, the university colleges, the knowledge production. So if we look at professions and professionals, I definitely see that professionals are trying to influence policy, politicians, and change the bureaucratic procedures. They do. But we might ask if social workers are especially difficult. I really listened very careful to the social work narratives, because they talked a lot about how they felt individually. So are social workers, ingrained in a power system, in organizational rationals and regimes that hampers or is a barrier for them to act as activists, as policy influencers? I would say that to quite a large degree. However, we have seen in Denmark, in Copenhagen, that some of our social workers has finally organized and put up their voice. We haven't seen that for a long time, but there are actually some very positive things. They are organizing and they are rebelling and they are putting forward their professional criticism of, for instance, local municipality activation regimes, social workers, sickness, working with families, with troubled families, etc. So something is happening. So as for service users and citizens, we see the very same, that we see that long-term sickness service welfare recipients are fighting back. We see that welfare recipients, in general are fighting back. We see that young people that has been in foster care are fighting back. They are organizing. They're bringing voices that bring forward. We see it in a number of micro settings, and they're very important. They get access to public policy, public media. They are being brought forward. I see that as a new tendency, and I think it's extremely important. And thirdly, the research and research dissemination. I think that in Denmark, surely social work are much better founded in research and research findings than they were for 10, 15, and 20 years ago. Social work research as an interdisciplinary, kind of endeavor is very, very important. And I think that there are, alliances, collaborations, and that the knowledge foundation are strengthened. And also it has the ears from the politicians and the top managers in public and private bodies and organizations, the key question that some of you had as well, what can we learn from research? Not as what works and best practices, not like that, but as knowledge that we can all share and we should be informed by. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. What about Finland, Camilla?
I think when Markus said that that with neoliberalism, everything has become much more depoliticized, and I so agree. But then again, I think in the Finnish case, Finland has always been a bit more depoliticized than the other Nordic countries, always. I mean, we have a very strong, there's a lot of research even from the 30s when the organizational field has been kind of intertwined with the state, and there's been this, I've done some research on the Roma activism in my previous research, and I think you can see how the Roma activists have been closely collaborating with the ministries, and of course it's good because it means that they've had access to power, but it also means that you have access to a certain kind of power and influence, that you have also, that these more radical forms of mobilization have been really downplayed, I think, even more so in the Finnish context. And I think I was thinking, I even had to consult some colleagues because I felt a bit depressed about this question about radical collective mobilization in the Finnish context. Of course, I think two things. I mean, as I said, we actually have, structural social work is actually written into the legislation in Finland now, which is great. And I think that's our hope when it comes to social work practice and management. The problem is that, with the hard pressure, on the one hand, it's not always, it's an ideal of doing structural social work, but for an individual social worker to actually be obliged or even implement their right to do structural social work and influence more structural issues that impact on the service users' lives, it has to be more strongly, it has to be more strongly, it has to be an obligation. It cannot be just that you have a possibility to do structural social work. So that's one thing. I think at the moment it's typical that it's more about reporting, that an individual social worker reports to a manager that this seems to be a structural problem with housing or whatever, and then the manager can do whatever about it. So it's not very limited in many ways. And I think one thing that will be extremely important is for social workers to collaborate and join forces with the service users, because at the moment the service users are left to themselves to mobilize and be radical and claim their rights, which they also have done to some extent, I think, also in the Finnish case, for example, to foster care, as you mentioned in the Danish case, and also to some extent when it comes to asylum seekers and different forms of racialization. But I think one thing that has a concrete example from the last couple of years is that we've actually had in Finland two very disturbing, tragic cases related to child protection where two children have died. And following from that, we've had quite active media debates and also some social media mobilization. For example, hashtag 1000 names which I think was quite successful, where social workers really mobilized against claiming more resources to child protection. So I think child protection is a good example where actually the legislation has also changed recently. So we have some, as you said, Linda, we have these micro events, but I mean, the larger picture is not very, I would say it's more individual activism. And of course we have social work academics that engage and are active in different organizations and so forth. But it's not enough, I think, organized collectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. And Kristin, what about Norway?
Yes, I can. I think that it's right to say that in Norway, the Norwegian Union of Social Work Educators and Social Workers has for many years played an important role in promoting just social policies and protesting against neoliberal policies. And the union is both a traditional trade union bargaining for wages, but it's also a professional organization. And it's a part of the labor organization in Norway, and it has over 30,000 members. And it is students can also join the union, and it is an important meeting place for social workers, students, academics in social work. And I think this is important in Norway. And the last years, we have also seen a mobilization outside the union, where, for instance, I think it was in 2019, there was a new organization, a network, which in Norwegian is called Sosialpolitisk Forening, which is a network of social workers who have established a manifest that they directly towards neoliberal policies and rising inequalities in Norway, and are writing critical articles and try to raise a debate. And there have also been other nationwide campaigns. Like in 2019, there was the Norwegian Conservative Prime Minister. She was saying in her speech at New Year's Eve that she wanted more successful stories from the child welfare services in Norway. And the response was a nationwide campaign where social workers answered that so do we, but we need more employed and educated staff to work in child welfare services, because there had been a discussion about the need for raising competence, but what to do with your competence if you don't have time to talk with the children and you are not enough people. So this has been this was just an example, but there have also been other sort of campaigns that have been functioning as mobilizing the discussions. But I think we need more of this. And I think also that as academics, it's important that we take part in the social movements and also try to strengthen the unions, because the unions in the Norwegian and the Nordic welfare state, it's very much the success factor of the welfare states, that we have had strong unions and they are not declining as much as in the rest of Europe, but also we need more people to engage and also to have the bridge between social work practice and academics discussing together and finding arenas to discuss together, I think. And there might be other people joining this conference today who know more about this from a Norwegian perspective, but thank you.
Thank you, Ann-Kristin. And Marcus, please, what about Sweden?
Yeah, what about this? No, I was thinking about, I'm very bad at being positive or finding, I'm often very negative as a person in general, but I will try to be a bit more positive, but I will start negatively because I think also what neoliberalism also does is fragmentize time really for us all really in some way. And I think that's affecting how we mobilize against it. I think it was Therese Järpe who wrote about it, I think last year or 2 years ago, about how social workers do resistance really. And what she found out was that there's a lot of micro resistance being made, but it tends to be made in the same context as neoliberalism itself. I mean, by measuring the workload and different aspects of the workload, and also creating new categories when trying to resist the old categories. Someone asked about the name. I think it was Therese Järpe. I will write it then in the chat. So I think that's really. I think that's a problem, really. How do we mobilize and how do we resist without doing more of the same, really? But to be more positive, then I actually do think that something can be learned in Sweden from 2015, when a lot of migrants came to Sweden at the same time, when we actually saw how painfully clear it was that the welfare system was not able to handle the social issues at stake, really. It was rather a mobilization by social workers, academics, volunteers, and service users themselves together, creating a really parallel migration system for a short period of time. And I think that's those collaborations that were initiated then and there, they really live today. Because me and a colleague have looked at how organizations work during COVID-19, and we can see that similar collaborations are still at play. I mean, the organizations and social workers that started working together during 2015 can learn from that and work again together to mobilize and do something else, really. So I think it's really interesting to see both what COVID-19 has done and what 2015 did to the Swedish welfare state, and that it was not able to handle those issues themselves, really. And in that, I think we can see new ways of doing social work, actually. I don't know if I answered the question. Everyone is still, but I think there's something there that's interesting, really.
Yes, thank you. I had some other questions, but I think given the time frame, it's we or all here are academics. And I think what's happening now is based on the neoliberalization, also of the education, research, what is, I mean, things that relates to our profession as academics. So I want just you to very shortly reflect over the situation in the universities and the possibilities for getting funding, doing research of radical social work, or having radical critical courses in the universities. Just short reflections. Thank you. Linda.
Yes, thank you. Important, but also difficult question, I think. So let me just sketch out a couple of themes. Social work research needs to be interdisciplinary. So it needs to be part of, many departments, and it's not always, I mean, social work is not always of interest to scholars, I have to say. I would want, universities to dig much more into research problems, real life problems that are of importance for social work. So we should actually inspire that. We should actually initiate that much more. Secondly, I think that as the neoliberal universities are very much oriented towards external funding, so we have explicit a problem because critical social work research is difficult to be funded from. The neoliberal regime with all its keywords, as you have said, as we have all said. That's what the funding bodies want. That's the type of research. So we have actually a challenge, in getting our research funded. So that means that way too much important, necessary research on social work has to be funded by ourselves, that we have to do it by ourselves. That's a huge problem and a huge challenge. So part of what we are going to do at the universities is actually to influence policy and policy decisions on research funding on social work themes, but it's also to influence, the foundations. The foundations in Denmark has a huge impact on research, way too much. And they decide as well, and they are also actually part of the neoliberal regime, whereas they should also, put out a free funding for us to do. And then university teaching and critical issues and critical themes, I think it's possible. I would say it is possible, although in Denmark, there are some politicians that are looking very, very, very nitty-gritty into, critical research, also within social work. And they should be pushed off, of course, and we are doing that. But I think it is possible, but I still, the lack of interest in social work, dominant theme is also reflected in the courses. So it's but I think we have to take somewhat of a co-responsibility for that, because too few researchers actually engage in this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Camilla, how is in Finland?
Well, I think in the Finnish case, it's a bit arbitrary. That in a way, I think there is some hope, because as a lecturer in social work in Finland, you still have a kind of an autonomous position. So it's very much up to the individual lecturer. And I think it's really nice to see that there are an increasing number of researchers, scholars, lecturers employed at the universities that has a background in radical social work and are interested in these themes, and also have a chance to develop courses related to these topics, which is really nice. But it still also means that it's very much up to the individual. So if you have, if it's a unit where you don't have lecturers that are interested in these topics, they are very easily left behind, and there's very little teaching on these topics. Then, of course, in Finland, since our education is constructed in a way that you're also taking a lot of general social sciences classes as minor subjects parallel with the social work classes. So I think that has its advantages, I guess, in case you have a chance to more broadly learn about issues related to injustices and neoliberal change, for example, within administration and political science and the economy. But it also, obviously it's very much dependent on the kind of content and the kind of teaching that you get. But obviously we have the same, I think, when it comes to research funding and general changes within the universities, it's a lot of problems with the research being almost totally dependent on external funding and policy making around what kind of research that's being funded or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. And what about Norway? The academic situation there?
I can comment on the chapter that I've written with two colleagues about social work education and neoliberal reforms. And we are discussing that social work education, who traditionally is a discipline that values problem-solving pedagogic and critical self-reflection, both individual counseling and more intimate classes and groups, are of great importance when you are going to discuss critical themes. And of course, when we have had the neoliberal reforms that are pressuring for larger classes, for interdisciplinary classes, and also for reducing the costs of using academic staff, and to a larger extent wants to use assistants in the bachelor programs, for instance. I think that social work education are more vulnerable to the neoliberal reforms. And I think that as educators, we need to discuss this and try to promote the traditional methods and pedagogics of social work, because it's only we that can argue for why they are needed. Why is it a need for the students to discuss and to practice in relation to us as educators? And I think it's possible. I'm not that pessimistic as Marcus, perhaps, but I think hope is power as well. We need to sort of, to stand up for the social work pedagogic tradition. I think, and it's us that can do it, really.
Thank you. And to the pessimist, Marcus, you have to defend yourself here.
Yes, I'm actually writing about hope as a neoliberal power regime right now. But I actually agree. I agree with Kristin. I think we do have a lot of. I mean, inside the universities, we also have a lot of power to do things and to change things, I think. But I also see that is, from my perspective, it's an increasing pressure also on social work educations to create employable social workers. That is, social workers that can work with specific systems or methods or whatever. And I think that's important to resist as well as educators in some way. And I also find it quite difficult to get funding for critical and radical research. So I think I think this is a good example that we should get together more and discuss these issues to be able to mobilize and create difference, I think. But yeah, still negative, but also a bit positive.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus, with this politically correct answer. But yes, I agree. I mean, the question was related to what happened just a couple of days ago. We heard about the Minister of Education in France, who ordered an investigation into researchers in French universities and their connections to Islamo-leftist network, as they called it, in research. And we know these things comes at least to Sweden always in a silent form, not by a minister, but it's going to be done. Anyway, that's why the question was. But thank you very much for all of you participating here, helping us discuss these very important questions. And I hope that we continue our discussions in other forms. And I just want to say that we have a few minutes to 10 minutes maybe to have a short break. Then Jessica is going to present a study which is related really to our last question, which is about curriculum and course literature, everything. Jessica and Marcus Lowry did the research on about all universities' curriculum and have some very interesting results to present. So we get together again in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.